part of the motivation for writing the Foundation was, let's see, was because Asimov had read the Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and he wanted to explore that theme in space, the idea of a dark age and possibly limiting a dark age. So themes of collapse, sclerotic leadership, lack of innovation, et cetera, were a part of this. So, no sound for 2 minutes. Okay, guys. Well, let me back it up again. I read this like 15 to 20 years ago. And when I was a kid, I wasn't entirely satisfied with it. But that was because I was reading it expecting character development and narrative drive rather than what Asimov intended to explore big ideas. So I thought, well, let's reread it, because a lot of what he says about collapse and empires is sort of what I'm talking about now. I've often jokingly said that I'm Hari Seldon talking about the collapse of an empire that nobody's listening to. So for that, let's just say hello to the chat. We've got Minoan, Voltra, Zero World, Cool Chickens, MR, Mavericksim, Jeziel. Hello, everyone. So first of all, from the stories, the chapter headings in the Foundation, the first book of the series, basically were released over a 2-year period in astounding science fiction from 1942 to 1944. They were all published as a complete work in 1951, entitled The Foundation, which is the first of a series of books called the Foundation Trilogy, which includes the Foundation, the Foundation and Empire, and the Second Foundation. And I read all those. There's also 2 sequels and 2 prequels, which I have not read. So there's actually 7 books total in the whole series, but I've only read the core 3. So Asimov was inspired to write this by reading Gibbon and Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire and musing about these concepts in space. Now, one of the things that is helpful in understanding the way he sets up these crises and these struggles is, in a lot of regards, writing a book for a lay audience in science fiction is a lot like a silent film. So in a silent film, the actor has to gesticulate and make exaggerated facial or expressions or bodily motions in order to communicate to the watcher what's going on, because you can't hear anything. Now, obviously, with a lay audience in science fiction, you can't make it too complicated or intricate lest you lose them. So there's something sort of like that going on here. So the basic premise is in the year 12,067 GE galactic era, the 12,000-year-old galactic empire is declining. Hari Seldon is a mathematician and a psychologist who developed a principle called psychohistory, a new field of science and psychology that discusses historical events. And basically the premise for psychohistory is that, well, the activities of an individual human are difficult, if not impossible, to predict and calculate. Group behaviors can be calculated, especially within, given ranges of parameters placed on them by the material conditions they live in. So on the one hand, we see a sort of implicit materialism assumed by Asimov, that if we can look at the material conditions and we can control for large bodies of individuals, we can make fairly accurate predictions up to, 1,000 years out. Seldon argues that there's going to be a 30,000-year dark age, which could be shortened to 1,000 years if the Foundation is allowed to set up a germ for a second empire. And so in this first essay, or first chapter, The Psychohistorians, we meet a guy named Gal Dornick, who's a psychologist who's hired by Hari Seldon and the Foundation to work for them. Now, he doesn't know anything about psychohistory, doesn't know anything about the sort of predictions for the collapse of the empire, but Gal Dornick just needs a job. He ends up being shadowed by Gerald, an Imperial agent of public safety, to his hotel. But at his hotel, he meets Seldon. Seldon tests Gal's knowledge of the psychology and attempts to persuade him through the logic of psychohistory that the empire is doomed. So the empire will fall in 300 years and leave a 30,000-year dark age. Hari Seldon wishes to shorten the dark age to 1,000 years. Gal initially balks at this claim, but is convinced by the logic. The next day, both are arrested. The trial focuses on Hari Seldon. Seldon is grilled during the trial. His claim that the empire is doomed is twisted into charges of treason, that he is conspiring to destroy the empire. Seldon protests his innocence, claims that the insights of psychohistory are so obtuse that most people cannot understand them, but if understood, would prove his case. The trial goes nowhere. Ling Chen, Chief Commissioner of Public Safety and judge of the Seldon case, offers Seldon a way out. He offers Seldon his foundation and his encyclopedia a home on Terminus, on the far edge of the Empire. Seldon agrees. He threatens Chen that if he's killed or something else suspicious happens, the Empire could fall not in 300 years, but in 3 years. Hari Seldon then tells Gall that psychohistory predicted the exodus to Terminus, and the transition is already in motion. So, from the point of view of, I guess you could say, nitpicking, it's like, okay, how this is sort of like prophetic vision, basically, but without any sort of divine recourse. It's just mathematics and psychology. That's the fundamental suspension of disbelief, right? Once you accept the premise that psychohistory is true, which again is a big premise, and a premise that later on Asimov will challenge somewhat in Foundation and Empire, we get the idea that, okay, well, that's the buy-in. And, it's the buy-in. How effective the story is beyond that point is if you accept the buy-in. What's interesting here is there's some nice homages in the trial. Seldon says that he's talking about the decline and fall of the Galactic Empire. Nice homage to the title of Gibbon's history, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Tranitors like Rome. An excerpt from the Encyclopedia Galactica states, it, being Trantor's dependence upon the outer worlds for food and indeed for all necessities of life, made Trantor increasingly vulnerable to conquest by siege. In the last millennium of the Empire, the monotonously numerous revolts made emperor after emperor conscious of this, and imperial policy became little more than protection of Trantor's delicate jugular vein. This is quite accurate. Rome was much like this. Rome depended on food shipments from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily. And with the initial disruptions by the Vandals from North Africa and Sicily, and then by extension, access to Egyptian grain, Rome shrunk in size dramatically. So this broad pressure is important for understanding Trantor. The other thing he does, he spends a lot of time discussing what a city planet would look like, where there's no vegetation, wild spaces at all. It's all paved over. One of the things he mentions is that one of the imperial administrators spies said that the planet is powered by the differential of the heat from the core of the planet and the surface, which could last more or less indefinitely. Now, I don't know if Asimov is meaning that to be taken as a kind of absurd statement, because again, the Empire is portrayed as absurd, sclerotic, and declining. So it's quite possible he doesn't mean us to take that seriously. Though if he does, I'm not sure I take that seriously, given the collapse direction that I've been going. But that's largely the main idea of the first chapter. The second chapter, the Encyclopedists, begins with the domestic struggle between Salvor Hardin, the mayor of Terminus, and Louis Piran, chairman of the board of trustees for the Encyclopedia. Now, at this point, because it's an imperial charter, the Encyclopedia has technically more power over Terminus than the mayorship. Now, Lewis believes that being an imperial charter gives Terminus protection from the rising four kingdoms. Hardin does not. He thinks the empire is withdrawing and a new power centers are arising and actions need to be taken accordingly. The two major foreign characters are Anselm Hout Roderick, envoy of Anacreon, and Lord Thorwin, chancellor of the empire. Lewis hosts Thorwin on a tour of Terminus, and Thorwin makes many flowery comments. Roderick insinuates that Terminus would need protection without the empire, a thinly veiled desire for annexation of the feudal order of Anacreon. Upon leaving, Salvor Hardin and his team amply apply formal logic to what Lord Thorwin said, and it turns out he said nothing. No promises were given at all. Being an empty-headed aristocrat was an act of supreme statesmanship. Salvor Hardin and his colleague Johann Lee plan a bloodless coup to take power from the Encyclopedists. The Seldon crisis is averted by Salvor Hardin allowing Anacreon to build a military base on their uninhabited land, with an appeal to the other three kingdoms that it would not be in their interest for Anacreon to get all the Foundation's technology. They formed a unified front threatening war if Anacreon did not withdraw. Anacreon withdrew. The end of the chapter reveals that the Encyclopedia was a blind. Seldon did not intend for the Encyclopedia to be the main focus of the Foundation. It was to be the nuclei of the Second Galactic Empire, which would shorten the Dark Ages from 30,000 to 1,000 years. So, as far as some of the nitpicks, throughout in this second chapter, the Terminus is described as being devoid of metals. They have to import all their metals, so metal makes a good coin. They claim that when Salvor Hardin is saying he's a man of people, he says that, we're talking about people's farms, homes, and factories, which sounds, sounds like a country in the process of industrialization rather than one that's already achieved it. And furthermore, when this was written in 1942, atomic power wasn't developed yet, not fully. And by the time it was released in its combined form in 1951, only the USA and USSR had atomics. So, could a city like Terminus really have atomic power if it was so poorly endowed with resources and so poorly endowed with industrial capabilities? And another thing that's required is that the psychologists be left somewhere else. The second foundation, which Hari Seldon says would be at Star's End, would be the psychologists, and they weren't sent to Terminus. So to keep these two practical sciences from the theoretical sciences. But then that just begs the question, why wouldn't somebody develop psychology on Terminus later on? Now, regardless, those are minor nitpicks, and that gets back to my point about the silent film. Asimov has to simplify things in order to tell the story. The other thing is, where would they get the energy for nuclear power in the first place? That's another one too. But here are the lessons, the important takeaway from the mayors or the encyclopedists. One realizes when one is in a Seldon crisis when there is no other course of action open than the one you must take. That's what Salvor Hardin says. The Seldon plan does not count on individual genius or knowledge about the plan. Salvor Hardin intentionally doesn't want to, quote unquote, learn more about the plan because he thinks it might disrupt it. So Salvor Hardin believes watching and waiting is the best way to go. Violence is the last refuge of the incompetent. The indirect method is to be preferred. Getting other nations to form a united front to pressure a bully can work. In light of some of the videos that I've done recently, I've actually been quite sympathetic to this sort of philosophy of Salvor Hardin, which we'll see again in The Mayors. The Mayors is the third chapter, and that deals with the second Seldon crisis, which is with Anacreon. And it does bear mention that Anacreon was the name of a Greek comic poet. So we see that Asimov is kind of showing off his education here. Salvor Hardin is being challenged at home by the Actionist party led by Seth Cermak, who accuses him of selling out to Anacreon and demanding direct action. Anacreon has founded an abandoned Imperial cruiser and wants it repaired. If repaired, the entire ship must be able to blast most of the other three kingdoms' fleet out of the water and conquer Terminus. In the time from the last Seldon crisis to this, Salvor Hardin has created the religion of scientism, where rites and rituals are merged with scientific knowledge and the arcane priesthood who only reports to Terminus. The offerings of the blessings of technology ties the four kingdoms closer to Terminus. Anacreon, under Regent Winus, is planning an invasion of Terminus and to assassinate the heir, Prince Leopold I. Winus casually refers to the accident that killed his father. Both plan on killing each other at the right time. Salvor Hardin plans to go to Anacreon during the coronation of Leopold I and forestall the invasion. It also is mentioned that the reason why the religion sticks is because it's a sort of a religion of the divine right of kings. So all the neighboring kingdoms willingly sign on because not only do they get better technology and all this hocus pocus they can do by atomic power to overawe the masses with their divine power, but also it's a sacrilege to attack them. So that's another reason how they got them to sign up. Johann Lieb uses as insane as Hardin is facing dissent at home and threatened a nation abroad. A lot of this, Hardin has a plan. The high priest Poly Verasov is ordered to foster a popular uprising against Winus. Winus invites Hardin to private quarters to discuss the facts. Winus boasts of the Imperial cruiser and his plan to attack Terminus. Hardin tells him he's already placed the planet under interdict. Only the temples of the religion of science still have atomic power. Everywhere else is down. No communication, no transportation, no lights. Winus says no matter, the fleet will conquer Terminus. Meanwhile, the mob has been told that their regent, Winus, is planning a sacrilegious attack on Terminus, surrounding the palace. The Imperial cruiser, now Anacreon flagship, captained by Winus' son, Admiral Prince Lefkin, a mutiny is organized by Theo Apparat, priest of the religion of science. He pronounces a curse on the ship. The ship is stopped dead in its tracks with an ultrawave relay and a remote kill switch. Then Theo Apparat relays to the Acrinians the message that Vinus should be arrested and sentenced to trial. Enraged, Vinus attempts to shoot Salvor Hardin with the blaster, but Hardin's personal shield protects him. Vinus then shoots himself in the head. Leopold I, fearful of his soul, does everything Hardin wants. The war and crisis is averted. The action is praised. Salvor Hardin as a genius. Nitpick. This was something I had when I first read it, though it's been moderated a little bit, and I'll explain shortly. Can one really found and run a religion one does not believe in? Can you really fake being a high priest if you don't believe, if you know what you believe to be fake? Now, the lessons. If you are dependent on someone else's energy source, you are their subject. If they turn it off, you are then unable to act. In light of the brewing crisis in Europe right now and Russia's gas war, energy war, this is very prescient. This is extremely prescient, how dependent a highly advanced technological society is on energy. And I think this right here shows some of the key insights that Asimov has. The other thing that's interesting is when he talks about the influence of spiritual power in the first place. When the Seldon hologram appears for the second crisis, he says, the spiritual power, while sufficient to ward off attacks on the temporal, is not sufficient to attack in turn. So what's interesting about this is Asimov seems to have a sympathetic view of religion as an earlier phase that humans went through that is defensive and not useful for the offense. Contrast that with the rhetoric of the new atheists, and you'll see he's coming at it from a very different position. The Seldon hologram then says that there's going to be the rise of nationalism, the actionists, which will then lead to the spiritual power overcoming, being trumped by eventually economic power. The traders, the fourth chapter, takes place on the planet Ascone. Master trader Eskel Gorov has been arrested and is sentenced to death. Gorov, secretly a Foundation agent, is seeking to trade atomics to Ascone. The government of Ascone will not accept the trade. They will not have trade with the outer worlds. They view advanced technology as sacrilegious. In order to get Gorov free, sell his cargo, and open up the markets of Ascone, trader Limar Panyets persuades the chairman of the governing council to allow him to transmute base metal into gold. A workaround is used. The gold is not sacrilegious, even if the means by which it is made is. One counselor, Furl, is met with secretly, whereby Limar plays on his knowledge that as a foreigner he will not be protected once the old chairman dies. He can protect himself with gold, but by accepting the transmuter and allowing Foundation men to use it for him in secret. He also agrees to sell Furl his load of base metals in order to turn them into gold at a profit. Limar, in order to keep Furl's loyalty, bluffs that he has a hologram video projection of their transaction set up in the square of the capital to be played if he's double-crossed, which he doesn't have. He's bluffing. Having bought Furl, who handily wins the next election, the planet of Ascone is open for business, and the Foundation agent Gorov need not return. Again, some minor nitpicks. Religion is for the gullible. Everybody has a price. What if you find someone who will not be bought? Now, some of these criticisms are addressed in the second Foundation with the mule, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. I won't talk about the mule here. Lessons. The indirect method is best. Better to talk and bribe than to push headlong and fight. Salvor Hardin said, never let your sense of morals prevent you from doing what is right, i.e. make a profit while doing state business. Yeah, we see this kind of like Machiavellian bending of morality. It's like, well, it's kind of dirty, kind of underhanded, but it's all really for the greater good. And if it works out in the end, that's great. So that seems to be this implicit mutual self-interest that Asimov is working from, which was common then and still common now as a basic belief for many people. And then the Merchant Princes, the last chapter in the Foundation. The main premise is that three Foundation vessels have vanished near the Republic of Corel. The implication is that Corel likely has atomic power and weapons. How else could this happen? Since the subjugation of the Four Kingdoms at Ascone, most planets in the periphery reject the religion of scientism since they associate it with the subjugation to the Foundation. At the edge of the Foundation's reach are the merchants, men who care not for the religion of Hardin, but only for profits. They seek to find ways to trade with planets, even if that means at the expense of their religion. Master trader Hober Malo was assigned to investigate the Corel crisis, with the leadership of the Foundation, represented by Publius Manlio and Jorian Sutt, believe there could be a new Seldon crisis. In order to keep tabs on Malo, Sutt sends Jameer Twir as a spy. Malo's ship, the Farstar, lands on Corel and is greeted by a mob claiming that a man who was a Foundation priest has fled to them for sanctuary. The priest, Rev Parma, if indeed he is one, and Mallow does not believe he is in violation of international law, and Mallow does not defend him against the protest of Tour and his crew, but returns him to the Corellians. This leads to a message from the Commodore. The Commodore tells Mallow he does not want the Foundation religion on his planet. Mallow agrees he has no use for the hocus pocus. He just wants to make money. He gifts some trinkets to the Commodore's wife. He also wants to tour the production facilities to see if they have atomic energy. He contrives this by offering to demonstrate the wares of the Foundation in an industrial exhibition. Mallow sees that they do not have any sign of advanced technology in the factories, but the Commodore's guards have atomic blasters with the Imperial insignia. Mallow suspects that there are some machinations with an Imperial viceroy in the area. Mallow is able to get lucrative trade deals with the Commodore of Corel using the butter in the guns and butter production debate to control Corel through consumer goods. A running theme through this chapter is that the small, miniaturized economic goods, both for industrial production and for consumption, are going to be the bedrock of an economy. And that if you can get, Corel to use these, it'll make them dependent on the Foundation since no one else can make them. Mallow leaves the Republic of Corel to Sowina, the former capital of the Imperial Province, Normannic sector. Mallow meets the old, dispirited patrician of Sowina, Duke Bar. From Bar, he learns the history of the planet. There was a revolt by the local viceroy for independence. Being loyal to the Empire and seeing a fleet being sent to restore Imperial order, Bar led a revolt against the rogue viceroy and greeted the Imperial fleet. Expecting glory and plunder, this new Imperial viceroy was unhappy and blasted the rebels with atomics and looted the city. Bar believes his son will kill this new viceroy and revenge the people of Sowina. Mallow seeks to gather information on the level of technology on Sowina and throughout the Empire. The techmen can maintain the power of atomics but not repair or rebuild any failures. What atomics Corel has are all from the Empire, and outdated tech at that. Mallow uses his personal force shield power by miniaturized atomic power source to surprise the techmen and get what he wants out of them. He later gives the techman a power shield that was designed to short circuit after 2 days. This new viceroy married his daughter to the ruler of Corel, Asper, to control him and use him as a pawn for his own ambitions in the periphery. Economics can gain conquest where religion cannot. Mallow returns and gives Dukenbar supplies for many months. A year after he left to investigate the Corel crisis, Mallow returns to Terminus. He's put on trial for allowing an angry mob to take a priest to the Foundation. Mallow proves this priest was an agent of the Corel secret police, making the case against him fall apart. After this, Mallow is swept up into the mayorship through democratic election. He then arrests Sut and Manlio. They were plotting with the Four Kingdoms to use religion to unseat Mallow, even though neither of them believed in the religion. So it was like the last gasp of the religion with some unscrupulous individuals. But see, nobody ever believed it to begin with. That's always been for me the weakest point of the religion of science. Salvador Hardin didn't believe in it. Nobody did. Corel, under pressure from the Imperial Viceroy, finally declares war on Terminus. Mallow seeks to embargo Corel and avoid direct fleet engagements. The reasoning is that Corel has more powerful Imperial ships, and their economy being dependent on the butter end of the Foundation atomics will crumble without their replacements. Nitpicks, miniaturized atomics. It's kind of goofy. It's the same way we think of steam and steampunk, so maybe this is like atom punk or something. The lessons. An excerpt from the Encyclopedia Galactica. So after 3 years of war, which was certainly the most unfought war on record, the Republic of Corel surrendered unconditionally, and Hober Mallow took his place next to Hari Seldon and Salvador Hardin in the hearts of the people of the Foundation. If you are the sole supplier of essential commercial consumer industrial goods and the nation you supply attacks you and you embargo them, the economic logic will destroy them. Again, this is the reasoning of Putin. And so what I think is so incredible about the mayors and the merchant princes is this is a line of reasoning that we see right now being used by Putin and OPEC. It's like, wow, this guy was like really ahead of the curve because it wasn't, well, we used this against Japan. We had the oil embargo in 1940. Now that caused them to then attack. So there is some precedent even before he wrote these. Mallow comments on the fact that the Empire never thought to build new atomic power plants, only to conserve what it had. And this ties into catabolic collapse. The Foundation can build newer and better atomic power sources. And that's something that Hari Seldon mentions in the chapter Psychohistorians. The Empire's out of new ideas. Everything's used up. So these are the things that are the big ideas that I think trend through the foundation. That in an empire-wide decline, innovation from the empire and its successor states is nil to nothing. A lot of the foundation's gains rest on the fact that their advantage in atomics and economics cannot be matched, which, if accepted, seems to lead to Asimov's conclusions. See, yeah, one has to assume that the empire can't innovate, that the breakaway states can't innovate, and that with this sort of like industrial atomic base that Terminus has, that you can sort of play these games. Which the thing that I would question is, really, would nobody else innovate? Would nobody else steal the trade secret? That might be a little too generous to assume. 2, religion is something man-made and used to control other men. Probably the weakest point of the foundation. If people viewed religion the way Asimov does, they wouldn't be inventing religions, and it'd be even hard to get people to believe them. 3, everybody has a price. We see this in the traders. We see this in the merchant princes. But what do you do if you find somebody that doesn't have a price? 4, forces of history are greater than any one man or group of men. Now, that I agree with. Once you have certain forces and trends at work, almost nothing can stop it. And Seldon doesn't try to stop it. He tries to build a new group that can sort of ride this collapse and then get ahead of it and then build a new empire. And then 5, the indirect method is the best, most economical way. So going back to the mayors, Salvador Harding, when questioned by Regent Winus, "Are you a man of peace?" he says, "I suppose I am. At least I consider violence an uneconomical way of attaining an end. There are always better substitutes, though they may sometimes be a little less direct." So one of the interesting things here is that this idea of the indirect method and this idea of lack of imagination, right? So for any given problem or any given set of problems at any given time, t sub 1, or more abstractly, t sub n, where n is any time iteration, most people tend to think that there's only a handful of answers, 2, 3, maybe 4. But really, this is all just a lack of an imagination. And that's, of course, what the Empire had, and what Terminus. The Empire had the lack of imagination, whereas Terminus did not. And so one of the things that you can see here, and this is an insight that I would agree with Asimov, is that many problems, both in an individual's life and in the life of a country, can be solved better than the way it was actually solved. The real problem here isn't that alternatives don't manifest themselves. The problem is we don't have a cadre of individuals who are educated and disciplined enough to be able to find these alternatives. So, for example, when it comes to the study of war, you have military colleges, you have professional standing armies, you have people that are training at every level to be ready, right? Whether it's, troops drilling on the parade ground, whether it's, generals and officers going to school. But what we don't have is a sort of equivalent parallel where, people of insight and vision come together to create new solutions. Because while the, in the modern age, there's always this lip service to, think outside the box. You really are not supposed to. Thinking outside the box is a euphemism for going from one simulation to the next, and you better go to the right simulation. Otherwise, we're going to punish you. Really, thinking outside the box would be the stuff we see in the foundation. And most people would not listen to that. I think maybe the other possible nitpick is that, would you really have a society full of such visionary men? Now, I suppose you could, because if you read like The Rise of the Roman Republic or the rise of some of the Greek city-states, we do seem to have, these inspired men that just come one right after the other to lead to great and newer heights. So there is some truth to that. And I think that, this is an interesting way to explore how that would happen. So, for example, I'm sure many people watching here can envision how the Western powers could have differently handled Ukraine to where he wouldn't be in this position. Now, even if we don't assume malicious intent on the leaders of the West, there's certain formulas that a lot of people just unthinkingly, reflexively follow, which of course don't work. If they ever work, they certainly don't work now. And people are just constrained by habit and convention and material conditions to not think in these new ways. And I think the main central thesis of the foundation is that we need to be imaginative. We need to be creative, because at that point, as an individual and as an empire and as a civilization, you die. That's where death comes in. And so it's this constant struggle to be innovative, to be creative. And one could imagine, what would it be like? Maybe that's what the foundation was supposed to be. But what if we had an organization on like the equivalent of a, West Point, but instead of training people for like strategy on a global level, we were for military conquest, we were training them to discover creative, indirect solutions to all of these problems. I mean, it's difficult to tell what that would do because it's never been done before. I've hinted at that before in my soft versus hard video. So in a lot of regards, Asimov is saying a lot of the same things that I'm now saying. And I think part of the reason why I have a new appreciation for the foundation is that over the intervening 15 to 20 years, I've learned a lot more that has allowed me to realize that Asimov was seeing things that I wasn't seeing. And so having got there on my own independently, going back to Asimov and seeing that he got there, I thought was really interesting. The other thing is, while the term didn't really exist because it was coined by Joseph Tainter, the idea of the collapse of the empire as described in Foundation is consistent with what we know about catabolic collapse. So catabolic collapse is the idea that you have complex systems that are all interacting with each other and they collapse one at a time. And the big meta system is the civilization of the empire. And usually what happens is there's essential operations that have to be continued and the fringes get cannibalized. So the periphery is abandoned because it's indefensible. We see an example of this in history when the Roman Empire in the 2nd century abandoned Dacia and Mesopotamia. And in the 5th century, first Britain, and then later, I would argue, the Western Roman Empire itself, which was an extension of this, withdraw to conserve your core resources. And this is exactly what we see with the empire and the foundation. So rather than building new nuclear power plants, they just maintain the ones that are at the core of the empire. And then those on the periphery, they just allow to fail, which is, again, the aspect of catabolic collapse, which I think is interesting that, now, again, this pattern could be seen throughout history. There just wasn't really a name for it until Tainter gave it. And if you read Gibbon, then, yeah, you could see this. And a lot of this is just, the Roman Empire in space. Now, the difference is there was no foundation. I mean, if there was a foundation during the Dark Ages, it would have been the Catholic Church and the monasteries, keeping all the ancient texts alive. But that's not even quite the same as what the foundation is, because the foundation never does lose the advanced atomic technology that it had. So, there's that aspect as well. And the other thing is just the idea of the radical dependence that people have on energy and infrastructure. When I read this the first time, I'm like, oh, come on. Isn't Anacreon or Corel going to have some sort of like backup resources, some contingency plan? Like, how does the foundation keep pulling this off? But as of the current year and Europe's crisis with Russia, I'm like, well, maybe not. maybe you're so far up your own backside you don't have a contingency plan. And in that case, it's like, well, yeah, he was. Yeah, I think it really took getting to the current year for me to realize how prescient Asimov was with economic dependency. Because once you get so complex and you need so much, say like natural gas and oil, or in his case, atomics, then yeah, you're going to crumble as soon as the switch gets turned off. And so, yeah, I definitely. Now, even if we argue that some of these events are a little too contrived and there'd be a little bit more fighting and bloodshed than what he would like for the sake of the story, fair enough. But I am beginning to think that his broad insights are still true regardless, as I've explained elsewhere. And The other thing that's fascinating is this is a snapshot of an earlier period of technology, an earlier simulation. This is largely before feminism. So, this is like the last, this is still that time when, well, it's even before, the TV show Mad Men, which I think takes place in the 60s. But, and also, given we have the internet and computers, they still have like paper. They're moving through space, hyperspace, but they're still sending their paper messages, which is funny. And so now, granted, certain technologies would be very difficult to predict, and I'm not entirely blaming Asimov for that. But given where we're at, given how we still don't have ubiquitous nuclear power in the West, and Asimov assumed that we would, and given that Asimov has these sort of utopian views of science and technology, it's kind of, well, I don't want to say ridiculous, but it's kind of quaint to see how naive he was about how long it would last. I mean, for example, the Galactic Empire, this highly advanced technological empire, lasts for 12,000 years. Well, I don't think the technological society that we've produced, say 200 years ago, I would be surprised if it lasts another 200 years. So I'm not even sure, if it's, but it's part of the problem is technology is so ephemeral. Like, why is it, like, for example, ancient Egypt, had a pharaonic form of government for like 3,000 years. It was a low energy state. Going back to Tainer, it's a low energy state, so it's simple. And it's not going to change much. If you have a lot of rapid change, like technological improvement, well, then you have a problem because you constantly have to change and adapt and adjust, and that creates friction. That creates, points that can break. So it's unlikely that technology would be as stable as Asimov predicted. And it has this subversive quality to it, regardless of who's using it. So now, this was, of course, written in the heyday of scientism, because especially in the 40s and 50s, there was this idea that, everything could be powered by atomics, that science could solve all of our problems. And, a lot of the stuff that we see, the 80s and beyond, which is much more skeptical of science, wasn't really there yet. So it's an interesting snapshot into an earlier period of American history with regards to science. And so what I'll say then is, I think the Foundation, with all of its accounts, is pretty interesting. It's nice seeing, the fall of Rome in space, a little homage to Gibbon. Also, I hadn't read The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire the first time I read this. Having read Gibbon, I can now see where he's getting a lot of these ideas from. I think the big ideas that he has that are absolutely correct is that forces of history are greater than any one man or group of men. The indirect method is the best. That economic dependence on energy specifically, they use atomic energy, can cripple a society if you turn it off. Now, of course, again, the United States embargoed Japan in 1940. That's why they attacked the East Indies to get their oil. So we could already see the effect of that even in 1940. But it's even more true now, as we see in modern Europe today. And also his sense of his quip from Salvador Hardin, the violence is the last refuge of the incompetent, which again, always there's even if there isn't necessarily a more creative solution, you ultimately don't lose much if you assume that there is, because in 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100 there is, in which case you'll find superior solutions. The idea of this sort of, like, for lack of a better word, cabal of imaginative thinkers. So that's what I have to say about Foundation. As I finish the other 2 books, this Foundation and Empire and the second Foundation, I will do book reviews on those as well. Let's check out the chat. Huh. Okay, yeah, I fixed that a while ago. Let's see here. I'm not really a Foundation guy. Worried Todd would yell at me again. Oh, that's okay, Em. That's okay. You're just on probation right now. Let's see. Vultra said at the beginning, good evening. It's been 20 years since I read this book. Cool. Eyeless King 1, love your work. Keep it up, man. Well, thanks. I'm glad you guys like it. M, haha, I remember thinking when the miniaturized atomics was kind of funny concept. Yeah, it's a little goofy, a little pulpy, but the big ideas, I guess, is what I'm focusing on. M, yeah, I think we were currently living through that realization that there is no backup plan. Cool chickens, before feminism, oh, what a dream to have lived then. Zero World, more book reviews would be great. Right, yeah. Yeah. All right, everybody. Looks like this is it. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.